Hello, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual event with Suzanne Simard and Hamilton Cain to discuss Finding the Mother Tree. Dr. Suzanne Simard was born in the Wenatchee Mountains of British Columbia and was educated at the University of British Columbia and Oregon State University. She is professor of forest ecology in the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Forestry. A former editor, Hamilton Cain is a regular contributor to the book section of Oprah Daily and also reviews fiction and nonfiction for the New York Times Book Review, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other venues. He is the author of This Boy's Faith, Notes from a Southern Baptist Upbringing, and he currently lives with his family in Brooklyn, New York. Throughout tonight's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can order copies of Finding the Mother Tree by pressing the green button below. That'll also lead you to our shop site where you can purchase Hamilton's book. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual screen.
Okay, well, thank you, Caroline. Great to see you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Hamilton.
And welcome to our a wonderful audience out there. I think, Suzanne, you and I are sort of 3 time zones apart, right? You're in Western Canada. I'm here in New York City. I will start off by saying that when I first ran across this book in the Knopf catalog months ago, I just knew I had to write about it as a book reviewer. It just hit my sweet spot, but I didn't know how sweet the spot was going to be until I read the book, which, no surprise, has been a New York Times bestseller and widely reviewed, including my piece for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Certainly one of my favorite nonfiction reads so far this year and in recent memory, actually. And for those of you who have not yet read the book, Finding the Mother Tree is just a sort of unforgettable lyrical blend of memoir and science. It's a book that's sort of sui generis in many respects to me. One of the things that I love most about the book, I love many things about the book, but how you, Suzanne, exalt the science, but you never dumb it down. You give it to us the way, we would hear it in a graduate PhD program, and I love that. And at the same time, there's this wonderful, vivid natural writing that stands with some of our highest literary work. As you explore trees and the relationships between them and the relationship with particular funguses. Some of its most literary moments remind me of, obviously, Richard Powers in his wonderful novel, The Overstory, and one of his characters is loosely based on you. And even one of my all-time favorite writers, Annie Proulx, who's a novelist who wrote a book called Barkskins, but also has a short story called The Mud Below, which she published in a collection about 20 years ago, in which your rodeo scene is almost like it's like reading the nonfiction version of her story, The Mud Below. And then one of the other things that it really kind of hit me this afternoon as I was thinking about our conversation, Suzanne, how, you talk about ecosystems and you talk about sort of complex networks. And it reminded me of a book that made a big impact on me about 25 years ago by the writer David Quammen, The Song of the Dodo, and which sort of really did a number on my head and kind of made me think about our Anthropocene, or whatever, however you pronounce that era, the way in a new way. And just because the writing, like yours, is quite beautiful. But then I started thinking about more recent publications, and it actually even reaching further into the past. This book reminds me in a weird way of Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which kind of revolutionized the way we thought about cities. And what she was writing about is, a continent away from where you are and what you're writing about, and yet the interdependent relationships, the lattice of relationships that you describe in the forest are very much present in her, in her scenes of downtown Manhattan. And I also thought of David Eagleman's book on the brain called Incognito, the hidden life of the brain, and the kind of relationships between neurons and the ever evolving ways in which, in ways we don't really understand, the ways neurons interact with each other. So when I ran across the word synapse in your book, in the communication between, all these plants, it didn't surprise me in the least. I thought I would first start off, and I'm going to let you riff in however you want to go with my general questions. Please do. But I wanted to start with, you write very beautifully early in the book about your childhood and your family in Western Canada. And I wanted you just to let our audience in on one or two of those aha moments when you realized you were going to live a life among the trees.
Well, I think, as a kid, your whole life is an aha moment, and I grew up in these rainforests in British Columbia that are just these cathedrals of trees. I'm so lucky that I grew up here, that, these are the trees, the forests that people see in magazines and National Geographic. They're the old growth forests that are, sometimes 1,000 years old. And this is where I grew up. And, it just became who I was. It was, I was born in these forests. I had my childhood in them. We had lots of adventure. In my book, I talk about one time when we were living in the loggers' houseboat on Maple Lake, which is where my family had settled. And my grandparents and my dad and uncles were horse loggers, and we had this family dog named Jigs, and Jigs had, we were on the houseboat, this houseboat that my Uncle Jack had built for loggers, and staying in it, and Jigs fell in the outhouse that was up on the bank, and so the whole family, like, my Uncle Wilfred, my Grandpa Henry, everybody went to rescue Jigs, and I was just a kid of about 5 or 6, and I watched this whole operation that was phenomenal. I mean, the men working, right? Just
rescue Jigs.
And to rescue Jigs, right? Yes. And they did rescue Jigs. But in that process, I just was mesmerized by the outhouse and the soil beneath that outhouse. And yeah, so that was one of my, I guess if there was an aha moment that you would never forget, that was one of them.
It's certainly one of the most memorable scenes early in the book, for sure.
Yeah, and who knew that Jigs would be so famous at this point? He's just a beagle dog and long past, but he certainly has. I think everybody has Jigs in their hearts now after reading that chapter.
Wonderful. So you just mentioned that you come from a family of loggers, and I was just curious how the forestry industry, which you started out in, has responded to climate change. That's kind of a thread throughout the book. And is there such a thing as sustainable logging?
Yeah, I think for the latter question, there is. I mean, my grandfather did that, right? He was a selective logger. They were horse loggers, so they only took 1 or 2 trees out of a hectare or an acre, and that was a very light touch. And those forests had so many species. Some of them could tolerate shade or grew well in shade. Some loved open conditions, but they created sort of like this variety of light conditions that these trees they just regenerated, like they burst out of the ground, basically. It was a hugely regenerative practice. It wasn't an exploitive practice. And then, of course, when I came on the scene as a young forester, which is when they first started letting girls into the forest industry and to study forestry, we had, the forestry practice had industrialized. And so what I stepped into was clear-cut logging, which is, 40 years later is still what we do. And this was completely different than what I experienced. And I see it as a non-sustainable practice, at least at the scale and the extent that we're doing now, to the point where we only have 3% of these iconic old growth forests left in British Columbia. It's not sustainable. It's way too fast, way too much. But there are ways to do this better. And actually I study it. I have this project called the Mother Tree Project, where we're testing these ways of leaving old trees like my grandfather did and comparing it to clear-cut logging and looking at the impact on the carbon pools and the biodiversity below ground and above ground and the regenerative capacity of the forest. And I can tell you right now, after 5 years into the project, into this 100-year project that covers an area the size of Denmark, that leaving old trees does keeps carbon in the ground it maintains biodiversity, and these forests just burst out. They regenerate really rapidly. So there's definitely ways to do it, but we got to slow down, reduce our expectations of exploiting so many trees from the forest.
Well,
and climate change, right? You asked me about climate change. Yes. Yeah. Well, now we know about climate change, but it doesn't mean that we're actually doing practices that are we could talk about that. I'm sure you have another question about that, but we still have a ways to go with dealing with that.
Well, I would love for you to just sort of give me a bullet point or two about how you feel the industry is changing as these challenges become greater. I mean, as we've seen with, fires not only in the Western North America, but in Australia due to climate change. How do you think? How open? I mean, one of the interesting things about the book is when you kind of butt heads with some of the leading lights of the industry at a time when your own approach to forests was changing, and you were becoming much more sort of almost a biochemist of or scientist of the forest. And I was just curious, has the industry followed in your wake, or I mean,
are they adopting some of these things? I would say no. Well, I should not completely no. They're edging towards it. The thing is, so we're still clear cut logging. We still don't leave old trees behind. So that's number one, is that needs to change. What they have done is they are leaving more native plants in the forest than they did back in the 1980s, when they thought they had shifted over towards this more agricultural form of forestry to try to favor these big trees, these planted trees. There's still plantations,
right? I mean, that's the book, right?
Yeah, that's right. Converting these old cathedrals to plantations and then weeding them out like they're cornfields. I mean, that has changed slightly, but it's not a lot. They're still actually spraying herbicides in northern British Columbia and killing aspens and birches. So there's been some change. Some of the things they have done is they're going to migrate genotypes north. They're going to do this assisted migration, but we need a plan for that too. And I'm trying to encourage them to, if we're going to assist migration of trees, which we need to do because they can't keep up with the pace of climate change. The velocity of climate change is about 100 times faster than trees can actually migrate, and definitely way faster than they can adapt. And so their only choice is either they're going to die in place or we're going to move them. And so, there are plans to move species and genotypes, but they have to be moved into hospitable environments. You can't really plant a tree in a big baseball diamond and expect it to live. It needs to have companions already there to help it along.
Yeah, it needs its community.
Exactly. It needs a community.
Right. And you're actually just beautifully pivoted to my next question, which is, when you began your career in forestry, DNA sequencing was in its infancy, right?
Yeah.
And how has the evolution, because I can't think of a better word, of genomic sequencing transformed the nature of what you do?
Oh, in a huge way, actually. So yeah, when I was a PhD student I started in 1992, my PhD, and I remember the labs were just starting to get, PCR machines, polymerase chain reaction machines, and everything was new to everybody. And I decided, in my wisdom as a person of like a naturalist scientist, that I wasn't going to use those tools then because they were so new, and I wanted to learn what these fungi and looked like under the microscope. I wanted to see the visual thing. But then, as I became a professor, I completely adopted those tools. I mean, they advanced so quickly, and now I use I use all manner of fashions of it. You can probe the entire soil genome if you want, which we do, right? We look at all the bacteria, all the fungi, whether they're mycorrhizas or saprotos or pathogens, and look at the whole community in some cases. In other cases, I use those tools to do what we call stable isotope probing, where you label, and I did this really in my PhD as well. I just didn't use genomics with it, where you actually...
There's a great bit in the book about this, actually.
Yeah, where you actually look at where the... Yeah, well, we use stable isotopes. So C13 and N15 are stable isotopes. C14 is a radioactive isotope, but you can use these stable isotopes that will then make its way into the DNA, and then you can see, and the RNA, and you can see which organisms are actually active, what are actively using photosynthate, and then you can see, what part of the mycelium is basically lit up by the movement of photosynthate through the mycelium. So yeah, we use it quite extensively. We label big old trees with it and then follow it into certain individual fungi using stable isotope probing. So yeah, it's been a huge boost.
You mentioned also in the book that you can literally sequence the genome of each individual tree the way that we individuals can have our own genome sequenced, and they're unique. And I was just curious because you had talked about relating this to climate change and moving the forest. How does that work? How do those tools come into play in terms of thinking about where trees are going to be 100 years from now?
Yeah, so the first thing you mentioned was like this, identifying individual trees and fungi, which is super interesting technique that we use called it's looking at microsatellites, which are very short sequences of DNA where you can distinguish one individual from another. So obviously you and I are separate individuals, but you could use that on a human being. Right. You can use it on trees. You can use it on fungi, which was the most helpful thing for us, because you can't actually tell the fungal individuals apart when you look at them. So these techniques were like a huge advance to doing that and mapping what these networks look like in the forest. But yeah, as far as climate change goes, I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a tree geneticist, but the geneticists definitely are using these tools to understand, variation in the genotypes of different trees. So Douglas fir, for example, which I work with a lot, is very locally adapted. So it occurs in those mountainous regions from Mexico all the way up to midway through British Columbia. So it's got this huge climatic range with a huge amount of local variation. And they can look at that local variation. They can actually genotype it. And then they can start designing or breeding trees that will be better adapted, or they'll know how far to move them based on their genotypes. So yeah, it's a great advancement for the geneticists, the tree geneticists as well.
Just curious, this sort of brought something to mind right now. There's this aspen, I think, in Colorado that's the single largest organism on the planet. Is that right?
Yeah.
I've forgotten the name. I know it has.
Or the oldest, trembling aspen.
Yes.
I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's the oldest tree organisms. What is it?
Colorado or Utah?
In Colorado. I think it's in one of. I think it's in Colorado. I don't know. It's in one of those
places.
The question
is, these trees are all one tree. Would the trees' genomes be exact, or would there be some subtle changes tree to tree?
Well,
because this goes
I think that they would
a mother tree, like a hub which everything springs from.
Yeah, so aspen is unique in that it sprouts from this clonal root system. So underground there is this massive woody root network, and they've got buds along those roots, and then they will sprout up, or we call it suckering in aspen. They sucker up, but they're all the same individuals, so they all have exactly the same genotype.
Wow.
But in Colorado, that area of that one clone is huge, right? I don't know how many acres it is, hundreds, if not thousands, and thousands. Yeah,
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah,
square mile. It's
how far?
It's a square miles thing. I'd have to go on Wikipedia, which I can't do.
Yeah,
it's huge.
It's huge. So we have aspen up in Canada too, of course, right across the boreal forest, right through the temperate forest. And you can see, I think everybody has seen this who knows aspen, that you can see in the springtime when they start to sprout at different times, or the leaves come out at different times, and then they turn color at different times in the fall, and it kind of looks like a patchwork quilt. Each one of those is an individual, right? That's a separate clone that would have a separate genotype from the one that's coming up maybe a week later, or turning color a week later. But within that individual, they're all the same genotype. And of course, when I talk about the mother trees, all species can have mother trees. They're just the biggest, oldest trees. And in those aspen clones, anything that would be a little taller or a little bigger could serve that purpose. in our Douglas fir forest, they're not clonal like that, but certainly these old trees do shed their seeds, and they have relatives all around them that they can recognize. That we've been studying this kin recognition in trees, and so they don't act like a clonal system, but they definitely favor their own kin through transmission of information and nutrients and water to favor them to provide a better outcome for their survival and growth.
Yeah, I love the bit in the book about that with I think it's one of your grad students talks about there's a little zone around where the water comes off the limbs, and that's sort of the perfect, again, the sort of sweet spot for those, relatives to
Yes.
flow.
Yes.
I think this would be a good time for me just to read a little bit from the book, putting on the glasses, where you talk about, it's in your chapter 9-Hour Commute, which I think is one of the most beautiful and also crucial, pivotal moments in your book, where you're talking about I believe it's a Douglas fir, right?
Yes, it is.
One tree was linked to 47 others, some of them 20 meters away. One tree bound to the next, and we figured the whole forest was connected by rhizobacone. I'm sorry to mutilate that word. Alone. That's one of the fungi.
Yeah.
We published these findings in 2010, followed by further details in 2 more papers. If we'd been able to map how the other 60 fungal species connected the firs, we surely would have found the weave much thicker, the layers deeper, the stitching even more intricate. Not to mention the arbuscular mycorrhizal Suzanne, fungi adding interstitial components to such a map. As they possibly join the grasses and herbs and shrubs in an independent web. Ooh, did we lose Suzanne?
No, I'm still here.
Okay. And the ericoid mycorrhizal fungi linking the huckleberries in their own network, and the orchid with their own too. I just was a beautiful little passage that, again, gives you that science, but it also gives you this kind of beauty and wonder at the larger web of life, which we're only glimpsing here in the book. So it's so complex, and there are so many of these networks, and this is just the mycorrhizal fungi, right? And I always try to emphasize this to people thinking about this, is that there are all kinds of other webs in the forest too. Like, think of the bacteria. So there's all these bacteria that form microbiomes or microfilms across this mycorrhizal network, forming their own networks, right? The soil is full of fungi and bacteria that are networked together. And these bacteria, from cell to cell, they communicate as well. And, and then there's webs above ground. There's the whole communication network of volatile organic compounds moving from tree to tree. There are birds that move from tree to tree that also form their own webs, that, what are called nest webs. And, pretty soon you start to see not just the fungi, but all these creatures that are connecting the forest together, physically connecting it, as well as, through their behaviors and patterns. Have you read the book, I Contain Multitudes by Ed Young, the science journalist Ed Young, on the microbiome?
No, I haven't.
It's a really wonderful book. But it gets to this large, he's a beautiful writer as well as a science journalist. It really gets to sort of these really kind of, bacteria that live in guts of insects, and like, you wouldn't be surprised how much that impacts our lives as humans. It's really
we're microbiomes too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So just taking a little bit of a pivot here, one of the things that I just also found very captivating about this book is its courage in how you reveal so much of your personal life, not always in a flattering light. And I was just curious, was it more or less difficult to write about yourself and expose yourself this way, as opposed to writing about the trees, writing about the science?
It's definite. I mean, I've spent 4 decades writing science, right? It's a real craft and skill, and you have to develop that skill, and you get good at it because you spend so much time doing it. So, but I always loved as a kid in high school and university to be a creative writer, and I kind of, when I became a scientist, I couldn't do that, right? I wasn't. You have to scrub all of that creativity out of your writing. The less, the better, in fact. And so I had this yearning in me to always come back to that way that I loved to write before. And so there was that. But I also, knew that people weren't reading the work in the journals. Like, who's going to read those articles? I can't read, a medical journal because it's so complicated. I can't expect, people that don't have that science background to read, these really dense, complex journal articles that are structured in a way to read in a certain way, right? They're designed for scientists to rapidly pick up information. And if you're not trained to do that, you miss it. So I wanted to bring this knowledge, which is not that complex, but in the journals it makes it seem impenetrable, but it's really not. And I wanted people to understand it because we need people to get behind this science, get behind these ideas, so that we can do a better job of conserving our forests, protecting, our ecosystems, not just forest ecosystems, but all ecosystems, because we need them, right? These are our life support systems.
Yeah. I think there's, as I said at the beginning, real rich music in your language, and it's really nice to hear that you kind of were able to recover that, or to go back to that for the purposes of the book. Just sort of building on that, on this personal story, there's this wonderful moment when you have the aha moment about the mother tree, and let me see if I can quickly find it here, where you're sitting up against the back of, I think it's a Douglas fir, and at a moment when your own life is in transition. You're a professor, your husband and your daughters live 9-hour drive away, I think it is, and you're feeling very conflicted about this idea of motherhood. And in fact, you actually call your ex-husband Mr. Mom. And it was interesting to me that motherhood is very much a very under the radar not even under the radar, really a big part of that moment when you all of a sudden you start to think about the mother tree, and do plants not only communicate through biochemistry, but do they actually is there thinking involved? I mean, to go back to that word synapse, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, when we mapped what this network looked like, it was really clear that it was a biological neural network. They have patterns that are replicated across, all kinds of systems, natural systems, whether they're large scales like watersheds and, whole landscapes, or even as, in our own brains, we have these biological neural networks, and they have patterns where there are hubs, there are certain neurons, like you were talking about, that are especially important in transmitting information through neurotransmitters. And our neurons and axons have these synaptic junctions in them, and through that, serotonin, norepinephrine, glutamate, those are neurotransmitters that actually are, the electrical signals that are our thoughts. And so we were mapping the network, and revealing out of that network was that the mycorrhizal network, the one in the soil, had the same pattern. And not only that the chemicals that were moving through the network were the same, or had the same stoichiometry as glutamate. And actually other studies have shown that glutamate is the main compound that actually transmits through the mycelium. And I'm going, oh my God, it's so highly conserved, these intelligent systems, right? They're so highly evolved because they work so well, right? They're resilient, they're efficient, they're regenerative, they make, they allow things to recover, the plastic brain. You remember when Norman Deutsch, you talked about the other brain book. I read The Brain That Heals Itself, or The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Deutsch. And he talked, that was the whole advent of neuroplasticity. And he wrote this book that we could all read and understand. And I'm going, the mycorrhizal network is the same. It's the same patterns, same compounds. It has synapses as well. And it's regenerative, and it prunes back just like in a neural network, right? It has all those same patterns and functions. And so that's got me thinking about, of course, the intelligence of the forest. And at the center of these networks were these mother trees, which, of course, you're right, I was struggling, trying to be a mother at the same time as a scientist, making these discoveries. And I learned so much from the trees of how to move forward with with my own motherhood. I mean, that period for me was so painful, but out of that pain arose these, these epiphanies about the forest. Like, oh my God, these mothers, these trees are central. They're the matriarchs of the forest. They're what are, help regenerate the forest. And my own role as a mother was absolutely essential, even though I was kind of ripped apart. My family was kind of tearing apart at that point. And so anyway, one investigation led to the other, and they bounced off of each other, me and the forest, right? And my thinking
always in the forest, right?
Always. Yeah.
Childhood, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It was the whole notion of, well, it's actually funny just to think about it. You say when you have that moment with the Douglas fir, the tree itself wasn't a mother necessarily. It was a parent more than a mother.
Yes.
Could have been a father, but you go with the trope of the mother. And I found that a very interesting narrative choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like you said, like Douglas fir, most trees have got mothers and fathers in the same tree.
Right.
There's pollen cones and there's seed cones. And so I could have called them father trees or parent. In fact, in forestry, we call them parent trees.
Right.
Right. We call them parent trees. And it's a term that is easily forgettable. I don't know why, but it was the ability of these old trees to actually connect with the seedlings, their own seed, in fact, and also other species as well, and actually provide or transmit carbon and photosynthetic nitrogen and water to these seedlings, and it enhanced their survival and their own growth and fitness. And so, I kind of struggled with the name. I didn't want to stray too far from the science because I knew I'd get accused of being anthropomorphic. And yet I remember I was out with my crew, and we were, at the beginning of the Mother Tree Project, and we were saying, what should we call this project, right? This huge project that was about trying to save these important parent trees. And the students and I were sitting in this pub in a little town called Likely, which has got like maybe 200 people in it, but it's got this beautiful pub by this beautiful river. And we were having beers, and we were saying, let's have a contest. Anyway, this one student said to me, Suzanne, just call them mother trees. We'll all remember it. And so then that's where it happened. It was in that little pub, and that was it. Like we just now, I knew I wanted to call them that, but I was so tied up with the scientific and the meaning, or that we're not supposed to anthropomorphize, and yet it's people relate to it, and we remember it, and it helps us bring it into our hearts. So
it does sort of give it a lovely native inflection too.
Yes.
I was talking about this book with a friend of mine who's Ojibwe, and it made so much sense to him. It was so resonant for him. You also found your own story with the mother trees, right? Your own way out of this kind of moment of crisis or transition.
Yes.
It's in the book. It's beautifully done. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to go backtracking to one thing I really want to stress before we go to Q&A, and that is the first half of the book. One of the things that's so amazing is how you came up with experiment after experiment after experiment. The scientific method to test your ideas about what you were observing on the ground. Which for me, that's where I really kind of made the connection with Jane Jacobs. Getting out and observing and thinking about what you're looking at and coming up with interesting ideas. And I was just thinking about neuroplasticity and if the forest thinks, if trees think in a way, in some sort of metaphorical way, or maybe not metaphorical. I was thinking about, the clear cuts, that sort of, these cuts through forests where the forest has to where there's an injury almost to the system, and the forest has to kind of regroup and regenerate. Does that make sense to you, or?
Yeah, it does.
Early on, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole body of science now that's moved from reductionist to more holistic science called complexity system science, and it recognizes that systems like ecosystems are self-organized systems. That means that that at the grassroots level, at the level of hearts and minds, at the level of the of the communities, that these these creatures have relationships with each other, just like we do in our own social human communities. And it's out of those relationships that emerges these complex properties, these highly emergent behaviors that really forms the forest, right? The ability to cycle nutrients, the ability to clean water and generate oxygen and create resilience and health for people as well. Those are all emergent things. And so that forest, then, when it goes from an old growth forest cut down to become a plantation or to regenerate, it has to self-organize again. And part of that is the fungal network has to reform. And so you get these, these old growth forests where you can have literally thousands of species of fungi in the forest. And of mycorrhizal fungi, there could be hundreds of species, and they all do different things. They fulfill different niches to provide the nutrients and water for these huge crowns, these huge leaf area in these forests that photosynthesize. When you clear cut it, most of those species disappear, or there's a few left that are just these young regenerative weedy species. And so the forest has to reorganize around a lower diversity of fungi and a lower diversity of trees. And it does, and eventually it will become a forest. But the more legacies we can leave behind of those fungal networks and those old trees, the easier and faster it is for it to recover. And the more completely.
And the require biodiversity, which is really
absolutely, that's an essential part of it. You need that biodiversity in the soil, in the plants, in the community, to have that suite of networks, the arbuscular, ecto, orchid, ericoid that you talked about. They're all there in the forest. And if you have all the players, if you have the fungi and the plants, they will reform. It takes time, but they do reform. So yeah, it speaks to how we should be looking after our forests too. Like, we do need to cut some trees for sure, but the way we're doing it now is just like annihilating it, right? We don't leave much behind, and we need to shift our practices so we do leave these old trees so they can host these old fungi, so that the networks recover very quickly and the forest can continue to be sinks for carbon and clean water and so on, and drive those biogeochemical cycles.
One last question before we go to Q&A, and if you had one or two key takeaways you'd like your readers, to come away with from the book, what would those takeaways be?
Well, I mean, I think one of them is that we are at this critical point in our history, right? In the development of man and the way our climate is going, it's, we are at this point where we have to do something. We're seeing the consequences of not doing anything in our weather patterns, and the fires that are, becoming mega fires in the West, in the big insect infestations, in the key indicators of how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. Those are all warning signs to us to do a better job. And so what I want people to take away is that these forests are not that different from our social systems, and that we should care for them like we care for each other, as though they really are our ancestors, as though they really are our relatives, because they are. And then once we know that, we can care for them, and we need to protect these old forests because of the crucial role they play. And in order to protect them, we have to be active, right? We can't just be bystanders to this. We actually, because bystanding doesn't help. It doesn't do anything. We actually have to be active. And the first place to be active is to reconnect with the forest, is to reconnect your relationship. If you feel disconnected, go find a tree and just sit with it and be quiet with it and love it again. And then once you have that back in your heart, not that it ever left, but just to, just cement it in there, and then you'll feel like going and fighting for those forests. And believe me, the people on the front lines need help. They need all the help that they can get.
So we're going to bring Caroline back, but before we do, here's this extraordinary book. I just want to buy it. It's a great investment, and certainly one of the most fascinating reads I've ever come across. So.
Thank you, Hamilton.
Well, that was a great conversation, and we have lots of very intelligent questions from the audience. So we're going to try to get through as many as possible, and I'm going to try not to butcher some of these scientific terms because I was an English major. Okay.
It's okay. You know what? We can say them any way we want. We get it.
Okay. Sounds good. Suzanne Markley asks, conventional views of how genes are selected for and passed along over generations are often skeptical about altruism. even within a species or selection at a community level. Can Professor Simard comment on how natural selection may perpetuate or reinforce interactions between trees and other species?
Wow, that's a great question. So, I know that a lot of people think of what I've found as altruism, and that these networks are altruistic networks, but it's not exactly that. If it is, it's reciprocal altruism, in that there is a back and forth reciprocity between individuals and between species. And the longer we look at it, the longer lens we take toward it, the better we understand that is a reciprocity. And that part, though, even without the altruistic interpretation of it, which some geneticists would call it altruism. In fact, the people that study kin selection probably, they do use those terms, altruism. So it's not completely incorrect or outside the realm. But I just think that when I study these systems, I can see that that there are longer term benefits going back and forth. And it's, if you take a one slice in time look at it, you might interpret it that way. But when you look at the broader picture over longer spaces and longer time periods, you realize that these relationships are actually helping all of the species and individuals in certain ways. And that help, that benefit is to help them survive and grow and reproduce and be more fit in a genetic point of view. The way that this differs a little bit from maybe Darwinianism, which is basically is about natural selection and competition that leads to competitive exclusion and speciation, is that we focus very much in Darwin and natural selection on competition, and even though Darwin himself studied collaborations as well as competition, it was competition that really became the underpinning of natural selection. And it was also the underpinning of capitalism, which was developing, around the time that Darwin was doing his studies. And these things kind of developed together. The ideologies and the science were not isolated from each other. And now I think what my work and other people's work, it's not just my work, but Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock and other people who have studied endosymbiosis and actually, even like genomes of humans, where we see, genomes of other creatures inside of us. We are microbiomes. Now we understand that it's a much more complex coevolution that goes on, that develops, results in the development of species and their evolution and adaptation. And so now we know it's just a much more sophisticated suite of interactions that actually lead to fitness. It's not just like, if I can compete and I get more resources, I'll do better. It's not that simple. So I hope that answers the question.
I think so, and I love that idea of sort of this holistic understanding of ideology. Okay, so MF, the user, says this book is beautifully written. I loved it. My question is for Professor Simard. If you could please have an update on the projects you mentioned at the end of the book related to salmon studies. Salmon's feeding the trees. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question. So, I'm writing a second book, which is going to take the science further. I'm going to talk more about the results of our mother tree work and the salmon forest. And so what have we found out since I wrote the book? Well, I have a postdoc, or actually she's my research associate now. She's Tsimshian Nation, Teresa Ryan. And what we're doing is we're going to reconstruct some of these ancient tidal stone traps to try to find out how that affects the salmon runs, the local salmon runs or salmon populations in certain rivers in the mid-coast region of British Columbia, where the Heiltsuk Nation lives. And so that work is still ongoing. It's a long-term study. So I have to, one thing I have to emphasize here is that we're working with big long-term stuff, right? These aren't little experiments that you just do in a year or two. It takes years to actually even do the archaeological work to get approvals to do the work because these are ancient sites. It takes, we're talking about river level studies and trees that live for thousands of years. So these are big scale studies. And so it takes us a long time to get going, and we don't have results from that yet. But one thing we do within these studies is we do a bunch of smaller studies embedded with them that gives us clues as we go along the way. It's kind of like a scientific detective story. And I have a PhD student right now who's finishing up, and he's found, a few amazing things. So one of the things is we found that these salmon forests, where salmon actually are part of the vitality and the productivity of those forests, these forests are extremely strong, some of the biggest carbon sinks in the world, because of their fertility, because they're right integrated with the ocean. The salmon themselves are, this incredible fertilizer to these forests. And so they're extremely precious from a carbon point of view. We also know that that the mycorrhizal networks differ depending on how high the salmon populations are, how many salmon there are, that the number of salmon, the health of the population has a direct effect on what the members of those networks are, what the fungal species are, and how they link together. And I could go on and on, but those are some of the first few things that I can report out of Alan's PhD. And I'll be writing about it more in my next book.
Well, that's certainly something to look forward to. From Linda and Hamilton, this question has to do with memoir, so I'm sure you can speak to it a little bit as well. From Linda, as others have said, I loved your writing. We are reading your book in a book club. Our previous book was Lab Girl by Hope Jarin. I couldn't help noticing the similarity of how you each interlock the scientist's journey and the research and memoir. Did you read Lab Girl, and if so, were you influenced by it?
Yes, I did read Lab Girl. I loved Lab Girl. I think because, especially female scientists, we're not really written about very much. We're pretty new on the scene. There's been tons written about male scientists because they, dominated the scientific inquiry for a long, long time. So it's really nice to read about just real people doing this work. And I loved how she wove her own personal story together with her scientific inquiry. It wasn't really the reason why. I didn't say, I want to do something like Lab Girl. I really wanted to make the work so accessible that you're reading this story and you're absorbing this science just by chance, just because it's there at the same time. You don't have to work to do it. I wanted it just to filter into people's hearts as they're reading the stories, and then they hook into your brain, and then you remember it and understand it. And I think she did a good job of that as well. I think, I tried to make mine more of this long story of the development of my work so that I could show too that science comes from a place of heart. That I asked the questions that I did about forests because I came from the forest and I understood it from my own unique point of view. And I don't think, a scientist who studies forests who didn't come from the forest, they wouldn't have that deep, innate understanding and caring and love for those forests, and to put to really devote everything to it. I don't know, some do, but it's a kind of a different thing, right? It's almost like these forests are my home, and I want to protect them and I want to care for them. And it's my obligation to try to get the word out to the world about how they work and to study them. So I feel a very strong, it's a very strong imperative for me. And I think that Hope Jarin brings that to her work and her book as well. And I understand she has a second book, which I'm looking forward to reading.
Oh, really? Same publisher, right? Knopf?
I'm not sure if it's Knopf. Is it? Yeah.
Well, Lab Girl was.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, I read it too. And I liked it. I didn't love it quite as much as you do. I think actually the language in Finding the Mother Tree is just hard to beat. But that said, I think that when I was looking at Lab Girl in kind of the larger reviewing community, one of the things we did talk about was this paucity of women scientists, women science writers, women science journalists, and I think one of the things the pandemic has done actually is kind of blown that door down in a good way.
I think so too.
Even from everything from journalism to epidemiology, Twitter, and other social media. the women have been right there with the men, and it's been just extraordinary. And the insights and how they all kind of come together, both from women and men, has been really one of the few true joys and revelations for me. And as I've been sitting here in my apartment in Brooklyn.
Yeah, we have more, there's more time because we're sitting, by ourselves. Of course, I wrote mine before the pandemic, but it would have been a great time to do it because you just have more time on your hands, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to combine these two questions. Maureen Seaton wants to know how far away from the mother tree can its offspring be? And then Chef Stefano, do you think there may be a vital force that exists in the universe that is the brain the trees may have, something that we have not yet discovered, something that yogis talk about? It's not too scientific, but I was wondering.
Okay, those are two quite different questions. The first one, seeds fall around trees, right? The most seeds fall within a few meters of a tree, like a few meters of the crown of a tree, and then the density of seeds falls off exponentially as you move away from a tree. And most seeds fall within a couple 100 meters, or what would that be in feet? That would be like 600 feet, I guess. Yeah. So, and then their ability to survive depends on the other trees around, right? So around the immediate base of an old mother tree, she has her apron, her skirt, her crown, and a lot of seeds don't establish, or they don't survive that well right under the crown because water is intercepted by the crown and kind of drip down the stem, but so there's a little bit of, it's a bit dry, and there's not very much light, and so and Hamilton talked about this donut, this sweet spot around the tree. That's where most will establish, where there's a little bit more light. It's not quite so dry, and yet there's the other plants aren't really super vigorous yet. As you move away, it gets a little bit more vigorous, and so the seedlings have a little bit harder time. But also, these trees, these connections with the old tree, also, the density of those connections also drops off, as you move away from the tree. But that doesn't mean that, a seedling isn't connected to a mother tree at quite a distance. They can be, because seeds can fly quite a long way, as can pollen. And we have found, roots even of mother trees that go out 20 meters, which would be like 60 feet. And they would go even further. That's the furthest we found. That's the furthest we looked. So I think that distribution is actually quite a bit wider, of course, than the sweet spot, this donut around the tree. It tails out quite a long ways. But the interactions get more complicated, more complex. Oh, the other question. Sorry. Yes, the other question was the bigger picture question. Is there a brain out there in the universe? I think, I really love how James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis talked about the biosphere as a self-regulating system. I think it is. I mean, we have lots of evidence that it is, and that it means that that the cycles of the earth, the atmosphere, what's happening on Earth itself, there are all these feedbacks going back and forth between the different parts. And that's how complex systems work, right? As they find this area of self-regulation so that it's a healthy, livable place for as we know, life on Earth. And so if there is a grand plan, or if there is a brain out there, not to invoke any religious commentary on that at all, leave that aside, but just purely from a scientific point of view, it is a self-regulating system. It is in balance. And when it's out of balance, we know it. So that comes from evolution and these big cycles that we talked about, evolution of species and how they interact with those cycles. And so, it will be constantly changing and trying to seek that balance, seek that regulated system, so that we can continue to live here.
All right, well, we are hitting a wall here with time, but I do want to ask one more question. It's for both of you, and we always love to end with this question at Books and Books. What are you guys reading? What are you recommending? Of course, everyone should go out and read Finding the Mother Tree, but are there any books that you think pair well, or books that inspired you while writing this?
Hamilton, do you want to?
I can start. As a freelance book critic, I kind of have, and it's work, but it's play, but it's work, but it's play. Right now, I've just finished a couple of nonfiction books that I'm pretty excited about. One is a Knopf book, actually, called The Plague Year by the journalist Lawrence Wright, who wrote for The New Yorker about the year 2020 and the pandemic, global pandemic, that's just beautifully researched. It's just not a particularly long book, or you don't have to be a epidemiologist to appreciate it. He really goes into the personal stories. It's brilliantly reported. He goes all over the world, to China, to Latin America, to Europe, and obviously throughout the United States. So that one for sure. And then I just finished a book that's being published next week called Last Best Hope by the writer George Packer. It's sort of it's his pandemic book. He wrote it in lockdown about kind of the future of Western-style democracy, particularly in the U.S., but also elsewhere. And it's really a very dark and ultimately hopeful meditation. But it's one of the smartest pieces of writing about American politics I've read recently. And it is kind of like an essay in book form. It's about 200 pages. And then there's some great fiction. There's always great fiction. So, Suzanne.
I'll just mention one book that I'm reading. I've been reading it for a little while, but I found it hard to read while I'm doing the publicity of this book. It's so all-consuming. But I've been reading *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari, and I found it fascinating. And when I started reading it, I thought, boy, this is like a lecture, right? Like it's so well researched and so easily explained. It's like it felt like a course, and yet so beautifully written. But the other part I loved about it is the broader perspective, right, of the evolution of man and where we fit into this bigger picture, and how it makes some of the smaller issues seem so small. It kind of puts things in perspective really well. So it's a fascinating read.
Well, those are all great books. All definitely Books and Books staff recommends as well. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne and Hamilton. This was such a great conversation. And thank you to everyone in the
Thank you, Hamilton.
Thank you to everyone in the audience who also asked such intelligent questions. So yes, of course, you can purchase Finding the Mother Tree by clicking the green button below, and of course, every purchase supports Books and Books. You can also head to our shop site and order Hamilton's book there as well. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you guys for our next event.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me too. Thank you.
Bye, guys.